Good evening. We continue our lesson tonight on the creation versus evolution debate. Psalms 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. We are looking at the evidences for the existence of God. And of course, these evidences in his creation we can see everywhere, but this has come under challenge by some of those in the scientific community. We don't want to say a blanket statement there because there are many in the scientific community who do promote and see the evidence of God in science and promote that. But there are some within the scientific community who would cast doubt on the existence of God by means of the theory of evolution. Over the course of this class, we have broken down the theory of evolution into subparts, and we've talked about the associated evidences and which of those evidences are accurate and which of those are false doctrine. We've also looked at theological arguments, and these are arguments for the existence of God, logical conclusions that we can make based on just the way nature works. So these theological arguments were the cosmological. They were the idea of cause and effect. Material effect requires an adequate cause. The teleological, the intelligent design, or design requires a designer. Anthropomorphic, a fine-tuned universe. Moral argument, objective morality is not natural. And then finally, we talked last week about the ontological argument, the idea that God must exist in order to be conceived. The parts of evolution, and if just going back a little further, we talked about the definition of evolution is the change in allele frequency or genetic frequency over time. We talked about how this is true, and we do see this. There is good evidence in science to support this. This is the original conclusion, but from this, many false conclusions have been made. The subgroups that we discussed in part, the cosmological evolution, the origin of matter and the Big Bang, origin of life, the first cell, DNA, protein, which is called organic evolution, microevolution or natural selection, survival of the fittest, and we discussed mutation. And then macroevolution, this is really where the controversy hits mostly, and that's changing from one animal to another, one kind of animal to another kind of animal, also known as speciation. So we move on tonight, and we're going to talk about common points of debate. These are topics that perhaps you have encountered in the past. And if you watch any debates, originally when I was struggling by defending the faith in a academic setting, in the sciences, I started watching a lot of debates for the side of creation and evolution. And I believe that's where you can see some really, good evidence arguments. People tend to not produce the best evidence when they are summarizing the opposition's argument. So debates are really where you see the best representation of both sides, and I think there's a lot to be learned from that. So the first point of debate that we're going to talk about tonight is time. How old is the Earth? Is the Earth 7,000 years or 3 billion years? There's a great difference in those two numbers, an amazing difference between those two. You would think that it would be very easy to tell the difference between 7,000 and 3 billion years. But there is a great deal of debate about this. Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 reads, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sun and all that is in them, or in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So we see here a representation of 6 days of creation and seventh day of rest. Now, some of the debate comes in the idea of the Hebrew word used in the Old Testament for yom. Now, yom has many potential meanings. It can mean a 24-hour period, such as how we use the term day. It can mean just the time of daylight hours, somewhere between 10 hours, 12 hours, the amount of time during the day from sunup to sundown. Yom can mean that period of time as well, and it can also mean a undefined period of time that we would translate as age, such as when it talks about the day of the Lord. Yom is used there as the age of the Lord. That's an indefinite period of time. So there's a lot of debate of what that could mean in the Old Testament when it talks about the first day, the second day, third day, fourth day, so on and so forth. However, the modifier, the evening and the morning were the first day, and so on and so forth. And the way it summarizes, for in 6 days the Lord made, and on the seventh day he rested, and we, of course, in the Old Testament, they celebrated the Sabbath day. They didn't celebrate the Sabbath day in an indefinite period of time. It was the first day of the week. Or, I'm sorry, the last day of the week. Sunday is the first day of the week. The last day of the week, they celebrated the Sabbath, a 24-hour period of time. So we see the evidence within the linguistics of the Old Testament would suggest that these are 24-hour periods of time, and the earth was literally made in 6 days according to the Bible. So what does science teach us about the age of the earth? Certainly, science can give an answer for the difference between the 3 billion years that it claims and the 7,000 that we see in the Bible. Well, first we need to understand some concepts. I want to define what a clock is. Of course, we see a clock on the wall. You've got a clock on your phone. But here I want to define a clock as a natural process with a measurable rate from which one may calculate age. So there are many different types of clocks, different ways that we can try to estimate time in history. And it has to have several things. It has to have a constant rate, a measurable rate, and the problem with a lot of these clocks that we're going to look at here is that there have to be 3 assumptions that are made. And with these 3 assumptions, there are a lot of difficulties. The first assumption is that the original conditions are known. So we're going to get a little bit more detailed here in a moment, but let's talk about briefly radiometric dating. So you have radioactive isotopes that decay from one form or weight to another. This happens at a constant rate. So scientists can take a sample and measure the 2 different forms of the element and determine how much has decayed. Well, a problem with that is that they don't really know the original concentrations of these 2 elements. I mean, if you talk about carbon-16 and carbon-14, I believe, it's been a while. The numbers change. How much of the first and how much of the second did you start with? Well, you have to know that to know how much has changed over time, how much has broken down over time, but we don't really know the original conditions because we weren't there. There's a concept about apparent age, and we think about a biblical perspective. On the first day, or when God created all life, and let's say the first 6 days of creation, we think about, let's think of a very simple clock, the rings on a tree, okay? You can cut down a tree, obviously, many of us know this, that you can see different rings, and that's a growth pattern, putting on bark and covering it up with a new layer, and that you have those rings over time. Generally, kind of reference years because of seasonal growth. So you could cut down a tree and you could count the rings and reasonably estimate how old that tree was. Well, in the first day of creation, we had full-grown trees. It talks about it in the Bible. If you were to cut down one of those trees just the week after creation, how many rings would that tree have? There's the idea that when God created the world, he created it in a way that it was usable, that it was functional, that it was mature. There were full-grown, you talk about the debate, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, the chicken came first because creation was done in a way that everything was functional, everything could thrive at the point of creation. It was a mature form. So it would stand to reason that things that existed in a way that was like you would see, a full-grown version of it today. So you would think that in that case, the tree would have however many rings that size of tree it would be appropriate for. And we can apply that logic to a lot of the clocks that would otherwise interpret the world as being, 6.3 billion years. Or is that trillion? Billion, yes. It changes all the time. The second assumption is that the measured rate is inherently constant. And most of the time, this assumption is the one that makes the clock to begin with. They say, hey, I found something that has a constant rate, let's run with it. You tend to forget the other two assumptions, but most of the time this is accurate. It's kind of hard to make a clock if it doesn't have an inherently constant rate. But the third one is also a big problem, and that is that the rate has not or cannot be affected by an outside force. The problem with this is that almost everything, matter of fact, I would go to say that everything, go so far as to say that everything, every rate, everything from radiometric dating, carbon-14 dating, everything can be affected by an outside force. And because we don't have a camera on whatever is happening over that period of time, we can't confirm that nothing has affected this rate. Nothing has influenced it because we weren't there. There's no way for us to record that. So that's a big problem with any clock, is that you don't know whether or not that rate, that constant rate, which we've already established, inherently constant rate, there's no way for us to determine if that has been affected at some point in history. So though you may hear on TV or news or videos or movies, whatever the case is, a very strong proclamation that the age of the earth is known for a fact because of the scientific methodologies, know that there are some very deep flaws in any attempt to judge the age of things, because we just don't know, especially assumptions 1 and 3, the original state or proportions or conditions, and we just don't know whether or not that rate that's being used as a clock has been affected by an outside force. So let's look at an example. This is an example of a rate that would support the biblical time span, because there's a big difference between 7,000 years and 6 billion years. The moon is moving away from the earth at a constant rate. Things in space, the conservation of momentum suggests that things in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So in the vacuum of space, there's not a whole lot of outside forces at play. There's much less than here on Earth. So things that are moving throughout space generally stay constant unless acted on by gravity, another object coming into collision, energy of some form, interacting with it. But being left alone, it's moving, it tends to stay at the same rate. So as it turns out, the moon is constantly moving away from the earth at a constant rate. Now, over the course of 7,000 years, it would not have much effect on the earth. If you think it's moving away from the earth over time, then in the past it used to be closer, right? Well, in the span of 7,000 years, it won't make a great deal of difference. The tides might have been a little stronger. But if you take that same rate and walk it back the 6.5 billion years, there's a problem there, because the moon would have collided. It would have been in the same position as the earth, maybe even a little bit the other direction. It could not have been moving at that same rate away from earth the entire 6.5 billion years. So this is used as an evidence, a clock, if you would, that supports the 7,000 years of the Bible, because the moon could not have been moving away from the earth like that for the 6.5 billion years. However, even this clock, the idea of moving in space, that's one of the more dependable types of clocks, it still falls prey to these three assumptions. So let's look at how this breaks down even. Has the moon always been orbiting the earth? The original conditions, that's our first assumption, right? Are the original conditions known? Well, of course, from the biblical point of view, we can say that we know when the earth and the moon came into existence. But just say that you didn't have that perspective, just from a purely objective point of view, without any influence of the Bible, how would we know if the moon had always orbited the earth? Well, we wouldn't. We don't know what happened in the past. Perhaps the earth was by itself at one point, and then the moon came in like an asteroid from somewhere else. Just as a logical concept or a thought experiment, we can't know for sure what the original conditions were. So yes, this promotes the idea of the 7,000 years, but we can't know what the original conditions were outside of the Bible, and of course we have God's Word that tells us that. The second is the rate constant. Well, we did talk about how the conservation of momentum, most of the clocks, that's what they're based on, is that constant rate. So yes, it's relatively constant, although the third assumption comes into play. Has the rate ever been affected by another variable? And that's another thing we don't know. Could have a different celestial body, an asteroid or something, come close to the moon or close to the earth, and the gravitation pull will have changed that rate. There's many things that can, collisions of asteroids or energy, radiation, all these things can have some effect on these rates, and we just don't know what has happened over that period of time. So this clock is a relatively good clock, but it still falls prey to these assumptions. We just don't know. So let's talk about some of the other clocks. Some of these clocks are used to support the idea of the 6.5 billion years, and some of these clocks are used to support a much shorter time span of the age of the Earth. So radiometric and carbon-14 dating, it was carbon-14, I don't remember what I said earlier. These are very similar in their concepts. It's about the breakdown of elements due to radiation. So the idea is that you have a certain weight of a radioactive element, and at some point, or over a period of time, at a constant rate, it breaks down into a reduced form of itself. This is a constant rate. This is one of the most dependable constant rates. The difference between radiometric and carbon-14, carbon-14 is used to date things that were alive, biological things that had carbon, and one thing to note about it is much less accurate than radiometric dating. The most constant, the most reliable form of dating anything is radiometric dating, but there's a big problem with that I'll mention here in a moment. But radiometric dating is for inorganic material, such as rocks and strata, things like that. So these break down from one form into another. It's done at a constant rate, but let's apply our assumptions. Are the original conditions known? Well, we mentioned that at the beginning. How much of the heavier form of itself, and how much of the less dense form of itself? Were the original conditions? We don't know. So how can we determine how much is broken down? Has the rate ever been affected by anything? Now this is the interesting part, because radiometric dating tends to happen because you find these radioactive isotopes in volcanic material. This is the most reliable form of these radioactive isotopes. Now, the problem with that is that radioactive decay is affected by temperature and pressure. That's one of the few things that does affect it, temperature and pressure, extreme temperatures and pressure. Now, the problem is if you find all of your radioisotopes in volcanic material, well, that volcanic material used to be under a lot of pressure and had a lot of heat, which means that rate would have been different inside the Earth versus outside of the Earth. So that rate has most certainly changed. The geological column we'll talk about as the last slide of the presentation. That's one of the ways that people use to date fossils in the ground. We'll see that actually the orientation of fossils in the ground are not like you see in the pictures for the geologic column, but I'll go into more detail into that one later. Ice cores. So you might have heard about this. They can go into Greenland or Antarctic, or one of these places got a lot of ice, and they can drill down and take an ice core. And these ice cores, you can find layers. And what these layers represent are freeze-thaw times, and generally that corresponds to seasonals. Seasonal freeze and thaw of the ice sheets. So they're trying to judge years, and these really, really long cores, and they have to take it up in pieces. And they can count the years back, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, based on these freeze and thaw cycles. However, Can this be affected by any other variable? Well, certainly we can have thawing and freezing outside of the seasonal changes, even on a grand scale. Different events can happen to the Earth. Get hit by an asteroid, or you have a huge volcanic eruption that puts all this debris in the sky and cools down the Earth. We can have all kinds of things that affect whether something is freezing and thawing. So yes, there are things that can affect that. How many layers were in the ice originally? Well, that's the same question we had with the tree in the Garden of Eden. How did that first tree, how many rings did it have? Well, how many rings did the ice core have? We can ask the same question at the day of creation. We were created with a mature Earth, a functional Earth. The distance of the stars, the best explanation for this is the idea of the apparent age. Well, it was what's the purpose of the stars? To show the glory of God. Well, what would be the point of the stars? It could not display the glory of God if we couldn't see them. You can say, well, they're millions and billions of light years away. It's a measurement of distance, but that's how long it would have taken light to get to us. And they truly are, that far away. We don't know exactly, but, close enough. Well, if it was created for the purpose of glorifying God, it would be created with the ability for us to see it. Apparent age, a mature and functional creation. Caves. I used to go caving. My wife and I used to host folks going into the cave systems, and really enjoyed that. We would see these stalactites and stalagmites in these caves. And early on, when we were going as tourists, they would give these presentations on how long it takes for 1 millimeter of this stalagmite or stalactite to form. And because of that, you can look at the distance and say, well, this is a constant rate. It's this large, so we know that deposits were made at this rate. It has to be this old. Now, one thing that I noticed once upon a time, I was taking the bus into Atlanta to work, and I would go to the MARTA station. At the bus station, I'd wait for my buses there. And I noticed something when I looked at the roof of that. It had a big concrete roof over the bus station. I saw there were stalactites on the roof. I had no idea that bus station had been there for millions of years. Well, what happens is that rate is strongly affected by the mineral concentration that is dissolved in the water. So, rain going through some highly mineralized material like concrete and salt and things like that can deposit a lot faster than the rate that they would claim in caves. Now, certainly, some of these, they have measured the rate of some of these stalactites, and yes, it's a very slow rate of deposition of material, but has it always been that slow? Or could there been something where there was a lot of water on top of that cave and it was leaking down through a lot of sediment, something like a big flood, that would have caused that deposition of material to be a lot faster? So I thought that was interesting when I saw the stalactites at the roof of the bus station. Moon dust. When they had the space program a while back, they were going to send a man to the moon. They were really concerned about the depth of the moon dust. They thought that they put the lander down and it might go, submerge under moon dust, because the rate of the deposition of moon dust was so slow, at a certain rate, and they figured that if it was 6.5 million years, that layer must be really thick. Well, they got up there and noticed that it wasn't very thick at all. You can watch the videos. It's just a little bit of layer of dust. Now, they had the right projection of the rate in which the dust was deposited on the moon, but their scale of the 6.5 million years didn't match what they saw. But again, this, as anything else, falls victim to these assumptions. Earth's rotation. Earth is slowing down. This is kind of a funny one. If you go back 7,000 years, days maybe be a minute longer, a minute shorter, because it would have been faster. If it's going slower over time, you go back in time, it was faster. Well, if you go back 7,000 years, you might lose a minute because it's a minute faster in the day. If you go back 6.5 billion years, then that same rate, speeding up in history, we would all be slung off the face of the earth. It would have been rotating way too fast. That rate does not match the 6.5 million years. But again, it falls victim to these assumptions. Erosion rates, you talk about the Grand Canyon. Well, we see these layers. It talks about the geologic column, but they claim that the way the Grand Canyon was formed is slowly over time. These rates of erosion can be measured, and it only erodes away the rock at this rate, and that means that it has to be billions of years old for that canyon to have been developed. Well, there's exceptions to that. Let's say that there was a large flood and all that water moved very quickly, then you can have erosion much faster. The more volume of water, the faster the rate, the more erosion you have. So a lot of these things that we see, problems in the ability for clocks to measure time, we see can be attributed to a large flood. They can change erosion rates. Even the strata, I'm not sure if I had that on there or not. I had an experiment one time when I was teaching a college class, this same material, and you can do this at home. This is a lot of fun. Take a big empty 2-liter Pepsi, emptied out, and put some coarse rocks, some pebbles, some sand, some leaf litter, just different stuff, density that you'd find outside, and then fill it up with water, shake it up real good, and then set it still. And what you'll find is that there are going to be layers that form, very similar to the layers that we see in the crust of the earth, that we see at the Grand Canyon. Well, this is a result of the mixture of different densities of sediment settling out from a flood or a lot of water. So we can see a lot of these things, the erosion rates, the strata that we see, and different things like this could be the result of a large flood, the kind of flood that we see in the Bible. Sea salinity, the rate at which the rivers bring salt into the ocean. This is an argument for a younger Earth, because if you deposit it at the same rate, then the ocean would be so salty that nothing could live there. The comets melting as they go around the sun, they lose a little bit of material. So that you can go on and on and on with these different clocks, but they all have their problems. Some of them they're used to show a 6.5 billion year Earth. Some are used to show much less, 7,000 year Earth. It has to be under this threshold. But what we see is that any form of clock falls under some problems with these assumptions, and we have to keep that in mind. So the biggest point that I want to bring away from this is that if you hear someone making very definitive statements about the age of the earth, and that these wonderful scientific achievements that we've had to be able to judge this, realize that there are some major issues with being able to accurately and definitively understand how things were in the past, because we weren't there. And the methodologies that are used to determine it have major flaws. So that's what I want us to come away from this. When it comes to flawed science, there's a lot of good science out there. I work in the field of science, but if it comes between science and believing God's word, stick with God's word. So that'll be our conclusion tonight. Thank you for joining me, and we will see you next